Welcome back to another post from Theology and Religion with J.D. Reiner. Because we like to talk a lot about methodological distinctions between disciplines, religious studies or theology or science and religion, that sort of thing, I think that it is appropriate for us to have a discussion about the philosophy of history. You may know what philosophy is, and perhaps you know what history is, but you may not know much about the philosophy of history. Unfortunately, many professional historians either do not know much about this important field or refrain from discussing it much. They just learn the methods for their fields and then hurry to the archives to drool over old books and papers. They just like doing the fun part without having to think too hard about the foundations of their own field. We, however, are going to try to do a little more justice to the philosophy of history. Today, we will examine what that field is and why it is important for those who want to understand the past, whether it is biblical history, which is what we talk about, or anything else, really. Modern, medieval, ancient history, it's relevant to all of it. In future posts, we will look at more detailed aspects of this branch of philosophy. But for now, we will content ourselves with a short introduction, just a tiny survey. That's really all we're going to do here because I try to keep my discussions to about 10 minutes per video or podcast, because I know you all live such busy lives. So let's go on to the definition of the philosophy of history. As you can imagine, the best place to start is by defining the philosophy of history. Here is the definition that I like to use. Philosophy of history is the study of the purpose of history and what the subject of history covers. Essentially, it answers two questions. What is the overall point of history, and what is the nature of the study of history? This means that philosophy of history helps us to understand the why and the what. A third question, the how of history, refers to the best way to do or write history, which is historical method, and we'll talk about that too, but at another time in another poster, or something like that. Now that we have a definition, we can look at how the discipline itself works. Experts like Professor M.C. Lemon of the University of Ulster divide the philosophy of history into two major areas, the speculative philosophy of history and the analytical philosophy of history. These correspond to the why and what questions in the definition that we already provided, and we will look at each area in turn. Let us begin with speculative philosophy of history. As we mentioned, this area of the field discusses the purpose of history. What is the ultimate meaning of history? Is there an end goal to it all? What general patterns point to the great theme of what history is all about? It's a very important question. It's something that was very relevant from the classical world up until the modern period. And you may think that this question goes beyond the discipline of history itself and what historians generally do, and I would say that in a way you're quite right. That's what practicing historians don't really worry about that. This is where the philosophy part of the term, philosophy of history, plays a big role. Some of the speculative theories that you will find are similar to a religious understanding of the world, at least in the sense that these stories go beyond empirical evidence. So here are some of the things that speculative philosophers of history try to discern. For instance, they would ask something like, is history linear or is it circular? That is, does history have patterns that repeat themselves in an inevitable way? Is it cyclical, basically? Or does history move forward in an unbroken line toward the end of human existence or some final goal? Another question that these philosophers would ask would be this. Can history be divided into distinct periods? If so, then what are those periods, and what do they signify? We can see how an answer to this question can be useful, and I'm sure that you're familiar with the scholarly categorizations like the classical world, or the Middle Ages, or the Renaissance period, or the Enlightenment. But the speculative philosophy of history is looking for more than just convenient scholarly constructs to group periods and places together neatly. It really wants to see the distinctive periods in history as showing the overall meaning of history when they're viewed together. At least that's how I see the difference between what the speculative philosophers are trying to do compared to what the historians are doing when they group these events together just for methodological purposes. So now we will examine the analytical philosophy of history, which is the other branch of this field. This is a much newer field because European and American historians and philosophers developed it in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's not really something that came up too much before the modern period, but it's a very important question in our own day. So before the modern period, the speculative philosophy was much more important, as we just said, especially to people in Western cultures. So instead of trying to discern an overarching scheme within history, this field, the analytical philosophy, focuses on trying to define history as a professional discipline as it is practiced today by professional historians. So this field answers a question more like this: what is history as a field of inquiry exactly? To use Professor Lemon's words, it is the study of the types of history, such as narrative or things like that, the epistemology of history, which is how we know what we know about history, historical explanation, which is what does it mean to explain something historically, and historical subject matter, which is what subjects does history study. Basically, analytical branches of the philosophy of history have to do with the discussion about what history as a discipline covers, or at least what it should cover. In a future post, we will explore these different parts of the analytical philosophy of history more fully, but I hope that we have gotten the basic distinctions out of the way. So, you may have fallen asleep right now, or even though this is one of my shorter videos, but that is all I have to say for today on the topic of the philosophy of history, which is actually one of my favorite things to read and think about. I hope that you enjoyed this post. If you are watching this on YouTube or Odyssey, be sure to subscribe or follow my channel to see future posts. You can send an email to jonathndreiner@gmail.com if you want to get in touch with me. And if you want to see all my work in one place, then I invite you to visit jdreiner.com. You can also donate to the channel using the attached links if you wish to support the work. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.